Today's instructional video is about how to create a grid and how to draw from a grid. This video will be used probably more than by one class, so there's a chance that maybe your instructions might be a little different, so please pay close attention. What you're going to see is I have got an image here that I've printed out. You'll see the glare here. This is a transparency grid that's been placed on top of this. But if you are working electronically from home, then you'll probably have one created for you on Google Drawing. But I just want to talk to you a little bit about the grid first. Is that first, if you are making your own grid, you'll follow the instructions as I've given you as far as dimensions go. This particular grid is a 2-inch grid, but yours may be different. So again, go to your original instructions. But there's two things I want to show you. When you're making a grid, sometimes your paper won't work out perfectly for the measurements. Like for instance, mine was 2, and this is an 8.5 by 11-inch piece of paper. I used a smaller piece of paper just because it's easier for you to see it on the demonstrations. Yours will be bigger. But you'll see that I made a mark 2, 4, 6, 8, and I had a little bit left over. Well, when you're making a grid, what you don't want to do is take the paper and just flip it over and start doing 2, 4, 6, 8. Because what you're going to notice is, you see how like there's a little bit of space here. If you flip it over, what will happen is you'll start with your 2 inches here, and this little space will be at the end. And when you start connecting, your lines are all going to be crooked. So just make sure that when you start your measurements left to right, finish your measurements left to right also. That way your lines are straight and not crooked. For the sake of this demonstration, I probably went a little darker with my lines than you probably should, but I want to talk to you a little bit about how to make lines lighter. A good way to do that is if you take your ruler and you connect your 2 pencil points like so. Put your ruler on here. It's always a good idea also maybe even to spot check your measurements, like make sure it's the increments are the same. If it's a 1.5-inch grid, then every square is 1.5, or if it's every 2, but make sure it's consistent with the directions I gave you. But when you make the lines, if you want to keep them light, instead of grabbing your pencil way down here, hold your pencil at the end like so and just barely use pressure, just barely use it. And if you do that, you'll get a really nice light line. Like you can probably even barely see it on here. I'll show that one more time. Just take your ruler, go from one point to another point. If you're having to do this paper in some kind of spiral pad, it may be easier for you to remove the paper from the spiral pad when you do this. That's up to you. Just follow the directions of the size of the paper and the size of the grid that I gave you originally. All right, so here we go. We've got our grid drawn. Now, this is the image that I chose for a demonstration for drawing. Depending on what size of picture you have, some of you guys might have more of a square picture, some of you guys have a more rectangular picture, sometimes it's more horizontal, sometimes it's more vertical. I'm going to turn my paper horizontally because this is a horizontal formation. Some of you guys, if you have a big piece of paper, there's a chance you might have extra squares you're not even going to use. Sometimes it's good if you know you're not going to need all the squares. Sometimes it's nice to let that square be just like a little bit of a buffer zone, so that way if the paper gets a little bent or a little ripped on the edges, your drawing is kept safe and sound. But some of you guys won't have room for that. Your image will actually go onto the very edge of your page. So just kind of be smart and decide, look at the number of squares that are needed for your image and how many squares you have on your paper, and decide where would the edge be that would be most likely to get damaged or ripped. That's the side you should probably keep as a buffer if you have that choice. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw from here. And as far as how you use the grid, usually a grid is used to take something smaller and make it bigger. Doesn't have to be the case, but that's usually the case. And so what I'm going to do is I got to make sure I count the number of squares down. So I have 1, 2, 3. I have 2 down, 2 over. So 1, 2, that's 2 down, and then 1, 2 over. 1, 2, 1, 2. And so I'm going to draw this apple here. Now, how I draw it is I'm going to use a little bit of sighting and a little bit of educated guesswork. When I look at where the apple is right here, it's really close. I don't have to sight that. I can just make a little mark right there and say, okay, that's where the apple is going to be. Up here, that is really tiny. I could sight it, but I think I can just guess on that too, and I'm just going to make a mark here. And now I'm just going to create this curve. Look at this curve, pay attention to it. Look at the negative space. That may help me. If I look at the negative space instead of the apple, it may help me to draw it more accurately. And I don't have to draw it all excellent at the moment. I can just kind of come up and decide and shift and change. And after I draw this line, I look at the shape of the negative space here and see if it matches. If it doesn't, then I make changes as I need to. And I can always come back later and get it a little bit tighter as I go. Now, as far as sighting goes with this, when does that come in handy? Well, when that comes in handy is like, I don't literally take a ruler and measure, you know, and double it or triple it or whatever. What I usually do is, like, for instance, let me go ahead and draw maybe this section right here. When I look at this square, it was right here, okay? It was right here. I don't have to cite this, but this does come over. If this kept on going, if it did, how far into this line would it be? Would it be a half of the line, a third of the line, a fourth of the line? I think it's a third. Usually all you need to think of is half, third, or fourth. You really don't need any other increments other than that. It's just more of an educated guess. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend like this curve would go to here if it kept going, because it gets blocked. This apple gets blocked by this apple. But it goes to here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cite that. I'm going to say, okay, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's a little more than a third. Now, how did I do that? I put my pencil tip right at that line. I put my finger right where the apple would continue, and I go 1, 2, and 3. Well, that time it was a third. So I think it is a third, actually, from my point of view. So when I look at this line, this square right here, this square is this square. And it's a good idea to kind of go in an order where they touch with each other. If you try to do this square and then skip over here and do this square, you may end up have counted wrong, and then you'll have to redo half of your drawing. So try to do the squares as they connect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to this line. I think it's about a third. So I come in, I just kind of guess. I don't literally measure it. I just kind of guess, say, okay, I think that's a third. And if I want to, I could kind of cite it real quick and see if I'm right. And that's kind of, yeah, that's pretty close. So then I can come in here, look at this curve and say, okay, it goes to here. But I won't see all of this apple. It gets cut off by this apple right here. So what I can do is I can come back over here and say, okay, this apple's going to cover that up. Now, how high up does this apple go? Well, I think it's half or a little over half. I think it's a little over half. So what I'm going to do is I'm just take my pencil for a couple of seconds and just check it. I put my pencil tip right where that white apple meets the shading of that apple. Put my finger right here. And just see, okay, yeah, it's over half. So I can just kind of guess at that. Or if you think, well, what if it's way over half? Well, let's measure the shaded space and see how much space there is. 1, 2, yeah, it's not even a third. So you're going to have to kind of guess at it. So when you look at this space right here, it's this line right here. So I go to where I think half is, I go up a little higher, and I think it's about there. And I take this curve that was started and I connect it up, and then I come over and I just kind of compare to what I have and see if that works. I'll do maybe 1 or 2 more squares, and I'll call it good. Try to use your pencil lines really light and really soft. That way if you mess up, you can erase and it won't show up later. And the grid that we made it really, really light, because what's going to happen is when we get through drawing this, we want to erase this grid away so that it's really nice and light. All right, so I'm going to come on over and I'm going to look at this square now. This, I think, is less than halfway from this line to this line. So I'm going to measure it just to make sure, put my tip right there where the apple is, put my finger right where that line is, and I'm going to go 1. Ooh, that might be half exactly. Let's see. It's barely less than half, barely less than half. So then I look at the square, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Go over here, 1, 2, 3, okay? And then 1, 2, 3 over here, and it's less than half. So I'm pretty sure this is half exactly. I'm going to go a little less than that, and I'm going to measure it and see. Yeah, it's a little less than half. So I come on over and I try to create this curve as best as I can. I may have to play with the curve a little bit. Ultimately, I draw what I see. I look at this curve and see if it makes the same one. On this, I probably wouldn't cite that distance, but this distance I would. Like if I came over here and said, okay, how far is this curve where it hits this line on this square, how far over does it go? 1, a little less than half, I think. Try it again. Try it 2 or 3 times just to make sure. Yeah, it's barely less than half. So when I come over to this square, again, it's a good idea to count. I'm going to go to half, go a little less. I'm probably just going to guess at this one, kind of look at the space, kind of guess, hey, I think it's about here. And then I come in and I create that curve. That barely tips over. So I come over here, I barely tip it over. How far is it going to go into it? Well, I take my pencil and I sight it. I think it's going to be less than half. Yeah, it's less than half. So here's half, less, probably here. And you can do really loose, light lines to get everything done. Last little square I'll probably do is this one. This side is lower than this side. If I put a flat line underneath it, it's lower. So you can use alignments and see what things line up with each other. So I think it's about this low. And before I just keep on continuing and just assume that I'm right, I kind of look at the shape of the negative space, the shaded space, and this shaded space, see if they're about the same size and shape, and it looks like they are. And then as far as this goes, you can kind of just guess where that is. You can kind of create a loose shape or line. You don't have, I wouldn't shade as you go. I would only do outlines. If you want to do a shadow shape, like so, to kind of, hey, this will help me later in knowing where to put the shadow, that's fine, but do it very lightly because you don't want it to be hard when it shows up. Last thing I'll say is, we've already shown you a demonstration on blending in a separate video, but whenever you get this all drawn and you submit it to me, I'll look at it and check it for accuracy. If there's any major problems, I'll tell you, so you can change them and then resubmit. But when you shade, don't shade across these lines. I wouldn't leave the lines there and shade across them hoping they'll go away, and I wouldn't erase the entire grid away after I approve it. What I would do is I would start, let's say you start shading in here with your pencil. When you get ready to cross over a line, take your eraser and just barely erase it. You don't want to erase it with hard pressure because your eraser can sometimes leave kind of like a little layer, like a rubberized layer of eraser there. And when you blend, it'll create a greasy streak, which could be just as bad as a really hard pencil line that you can't erase and get rid of. But you just erase away the line that you need. Keep your pencil strokes really close together. And then later on when you go into the blending stump, you can blend it out. But I would only erase one line as you're crossing over from one square to the other. Okay? So this is kind of how you can create a grid as well as use the grid to draw. Please make sure you submit the outlines of the grid to me before you blend. I look forward to seeing your work. I hope this video has been helpful to you. And best wishes and happy drawing.